snow swept across the sprawling McAllister ranch like a white tide, covering fences, barns, and pastures under a thick, frozen blanket. The wind howled through the skeletal trees, rattling the shutters of the modest stone house that had stood for generations. Winter in the frontier was never kind, but for Ethan McAllister, the chill mirrored more than the land, it echoed the emptiness in his heart. Since the passing of his beloved wife 2 winters ago, Ethan had settled into a quiet routine of solitude. He rose with the sun, tended to his livestock, and spent long hours repairing fences or mending tools, but always alone. The townsfolk whispered about his grief, wondering if a man like him would ever let warmth return to his life. And yet, for all his wealth and standing, there was a visible distance about him, a careful wall around the part of himself that still remembered love. Ethan stood by the large kitchen window, his eyes scanning the horizon. The storm was approaching faster than expected. Snow whipped across the valley, and clouds pressed down like a gray lid over the ranch. There was a tension in the air, subtle but unmistakable, as if the land itself was warning him of something unseen. His gut tightened. Something wasn't right beyond the hills. He turned, gathering his thick wool coat and sturdy gloves. The horses in the corral stamped their hooves, restless in the rising wind. Ethan's hands, calloused and steady, fastened the reins to his saddle. There was a small spark of anticipation, an instinct that told him this day would not pass in the usual quiet rhythm of chores. As he led his horse toward the road that connected his ranch to the neighboring settlement, he noticed the faint tracks in the fresh snow. They were uneven, scattered, and desperate, as though whoever had walked them had struggled against more than just the cold. Ethan's brow furrowed. Mail-order brides were not uncommon in these parts, young women seeking a new life, sometimes sent to families who could provide, sometimes left to navigate dangers they could scarcely imagine. But for one to be out here, alone, in a blizzard? That was unheard of. The wind cut through him like a knife, and he tightened the reins, pressing his horse forward. Every step left deep impressions in the snow, and every glance toward the settlement filled him with unease. He could see the smoke curling from chimneys, but no figure moved outside. Silence stretched across the land, broken only by the distant howl of the storm. Ethan's thoughts drifted, as they often did, to his late wife. He remembered the way she had laughed as she wrapped scarves around the children they never had, her eyes bright with hope for a future she would never see. That memory, tender and painful, was a constant companion, reminding him both of love's warmth and the grief that followed its loss. He pressed on, knowing the wind could not extinguish the small flame of care that still flickered within him. Suddenly, the tracks widened and deepened, as though whoever had made them had stumbled and fallen. Panic tightened in Ethan's chest. The storm was gaining strength, and it would not forgive weakness. With a steady hand, he urged his horse faster, eyes scanning the snowdrifts. Then, through the blinding whiteness, he caught a shape, a faint figure, hunched against the wind, moving with difficulty. Ethan's heart pounded. Without hesitation, he swung down from his saddle and ran toward the figure, snow biting his face and hands. There was no thought of personal danger, there was only the urgency of survival, the instinct to act. As he drew closer, he could see her face, pale, frozen, and terrified. A young woman, utterly alone, caught in the storm's merciless grip. He called her name softly, his voice carrying over the wind. "Hey, can you hear me? Hold on, I've got you." For a moment, she looked up, eyes wide and glazed with fear. Then she slumped, her strength fading. Ethan reached her, lifting her into his arms with a careful strength born of years on the ranch. The cold bit at his skin, but it mattered little. His only thought was to get her to safety. As he mounted his horse with her in his arms, Ethan knew the course of his life had just shifted. The blizzard outside was ruthless, but inside him, something unexpected was stirring, a spark that promised change, and perhaps, a second chance at a life he had long thought impossible. The wind screamed across the open plains, but inside Ethan's coat, Clara shivered violently. Her body was stiff, her teeth chattering as if the storm itself had burrowed into her bones. Ethan adjusted his grip on her, murmuring reassurances he wasn't sure she could hear over the howl of the blizzard. The ranch was still a mile away, and the snow had risen knee-high in some places. Ethan guided his horse carefully, knowing that one misstep could send them both tumbling into the frozen ground. Each moment of the ride was a test of endurance, for him and the frail woman in his arms. When at last he reached the barn, Ethan kicked the horse free and quickly led it into the shelter. He laid Clara gently on a pile of blankets in the warmth of the loft. She barely stirred, but he could feel the shallow rise and fall of her chest. That was enough for now. Ethan's gaze swept across the room. The barn smelled of hay, leather, and the faint trace of smoke from the fire he'd lit hours before. It was a simple refuge, but it would have to do. His hands moved instinctively, removing wet gloves, wrapping her in dry blankets, rubbing warmth into her frozen fingers. He caught a glimpse of her face then, pale and streaked with frost, framed by strands of tangled hair. Clara's eyes fluttered open, revealing a mix of fear, exhaustion, and disbelief. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ethan McAllister," he replied gently, "your neighbor. I found you in the snow. You're safe now. I won't let the storm take you." She blinked, as if struggling to comprehend his words. Then came a shuddering breath, a small sigh that suggested relief, and perhaps, the first flicker of trust. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment settle between them. Here was a woman betrayed by the very person who had promised to protect her, and here was he, a man who had long buried his own heart in grief. Fate, it seemed, had a way of pairing the broken with those willing to care. But as much as he wanted to simply hold her, Ethan knew he faced a choice that would test him beyond the storm. Leaving her alone in the blizzard would be an easy way out, safe for him, but fatal for her. To help her meant risking his own life against the fury of the winter. And yet, some instinct, a force he couldn't name, compelled him to act. Ethan knelt beside Clara, keeping his voice low and steady. "I know you've been hurt. I know someone left you to face this storm alone. But you're not alone anymore. Not while I'm here. We'll get through this together." She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as they clutched at the blankets, hesitant to reach out, hesitant to trust. Ethan didn't push, he simply stayed nearby, letting the warmth of the fire, and his presence, speak louder than any promise he could make. The barn was quiet except for the crackling of the fire, and outside, the blizzard raged with a relentless fury. But inside, a fragile alliance had begun. One human being had reached for another, risking himself against the elements, and Clara, despite her terror, had survived. In that moment, Ethan realized this was no ordinary rescue. This was the start of a journey, one that would demand courage, compassion, and the willingness to confront not only the harsh frontier but the equally perilous terrain of the heart. The storm would not be the only challenge. She carried with her the wounds of abandonment, a future that felt uncertain, and a past that threatened to shadow every step. But Ethan, for the first time in years, felt something stir inside him, a sense that perhaps life was offering him a second chance, and that through this woman, both of them might find the healing they desperately needed. He settled beside her, keeping watch as the night deepened. The wind's fury continued unabated, but inside the barn, warmth slowly began to grow, not just in the blankets, but in the space between them. And in the quiet of that harsh frontier night, a choice had been made: Ethan would not leave her behind. He would fight, endure, and protect. And in that commitment, the first seeds of trust, and perhaps love, were planted. Morning arrived slowly over the McAllister ranch, pale sunlight bleeding through the heavy clouds. The blizzard had spent its fury, but the land remained buried under fresh snow, crisp and unyielding. Ethan moved quietly in the barn, tending to the horses while keeping an eye on Clara. She lay bundled in blankets, her breathing steady but shallow, her body trembling from the aftershocks of cold and fear. Ethan hesitated before stepping closer. The fire crackled warmly in the corner of the loft, and he knew she needed more than blankets, she needed reassurance, patience, and safety. Her eyes flicked open as he approached, the faintest trace of suspicion shadowing her features. "Where am I?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're safe," Ethan said gently, keeping his tone steady. "The storm can't touch you here. You're at my ranch." Her gaze darted around the barn, lingering on the walls, the stacked hay, the horses peering curiously from their stalls. "Your ranch?" she echoed, disbelief still mingled with the remnants of fear. Why would you help me?" Ethan met her eyes evenly. "Because leaving you out there, that wasn't a choice. And because some things, some people, don't deserve to suffer alone. I couldn't do that to you." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Clara had been abandoned, left at the mercy of a cruel world by the very man who had promised her safety. Her trauma was raw, etched into every movement and glance. Trust didn't come easily, and Ethan understood that. He gave her space, letting silence fill the room as he fed the horses and chopped more firewood. By mid-morning, he offered her a simple breakfast, hot porridge and tea, which she accepted with hesitant gratitude. Her hands shook as she lifted the cup, and Ethan waited silently, resisting the urge to rush her. The barn was quiet, save for the soft snorting of the horses and the occasional crackle from the fire. Clara's eyes met his across the loft, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. She was frightened, yes, but there was also a spark of resilience. She had survived the blizzard alone, and though Ethan had saved her, it was clear she would not remain a passive participant in her own fate. "Do you live here alone?" she asked finally, the question tentative but probing. Ethan nodded. "Since my wife passed. It's been quiet. Too quiet, sometimes. But it's home." His voice carried no bitterness, only the gentle weight of experience and solitude. Clara's gaze softened, though only slightly. There was an unspoken understanding that both were carrying burdens and that their meeting was more than a coincidence. She realized, with a mixture of wariness and relief, that here was someone who had faced his own pain and still reached out to help her. As the day progressed, Ethan showed her the basics of staying warm, feeding the animals, and moving safely across the snow-covered land. Clara was hesitant at first, every step cautious, every word measured. But gradually, she began to respond, an occasional smile, a question asked with genuine curiosity, a fleeting laugh at his dry humor. Ethan noticed these moments, small as they were, and felt an unfamiliar warmth. He had spent years keeping his heart guarded, yet here was a woman whose presence stirred a tenderness he hadn't felt since his wife's passing. And though he still held back, unwilling to let walls crumble too quickly, he found himself drawn to her resilience, her quiet courage, and the unspoken longing in her eyes. Even as they settled into the routines of the ranch, the tension lingered. Clara's trauma, Ethan's grief, and the knowledge of the outside world's judgment created a delicate balance. Every action mattered, every glance carried weight. Trust would not come easily, but with each shared task, each small victory in surviving the storm's aftermath, they began to build a fragile bridge between two wounded hearts. By nightfall, Clara had moved closer to the warmth of the fire, her hands no longer trembling as violently. Ethan sat nearby, keeping watch, silently acknowledging the unspoken bond forming between them. The snowstorm had brought her to him, yes, but it had also brought the possibility of something neither had expected: connection, trust, and the faintest hint of hope. In the quiet of the barn, as the wind howled against the walls, Ethan realized this: rescuing Clara was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, helping her heal, navigating her fear, and discovering whether two people, scarred by loss, could find in each other the beginnings of something like love. The morning sun, weak but determined, finally pierced the thick layer of clouds. Snow still blanketed the McAllister ranch, but the storm had passed, leaving a sparkling quiet in its wake. Ethan and Clara stepped out cautiously, boots crunching in the crusted snow. The ranch was a frozen labyrinth, fences half buried and pathways obscured, but it was theirs to navigate together. Ethan handed Clara a pair of thick gloves. "We've got work to do," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The storm left us with plenty of chores, and I need a strong pair of hands. Clara accepted them, a flicker of determination in her eyes. Though still fragile from the blizzard, there was a spark of resilience she refused to hide. She had been abandoned once, she would not let herself be helpless again. They started with the barn, tending to the livestock. Horses whinnied, their breath visible in the cold air, and chickens huddled beneath the roosts. Ethan showed Clara how to carefully break ice in the troughs without startling the animals. When she dropped a piece of ice onto the frozen ground and it skittered across her boots, they both laughed, the sound surprising them against the silence of the snow. It was the first time Clara had smiled in what felt like an eternity. After the barn, they gathered firewood. Ethan handed her the axe and demonstrated how to split logs. Clara's first swing wobbled, and the axe glanced off the log. She flinched, but Ethan's calm voice reassured her. "Steady, bend your knees, let the wood guide the strike." She tried again, this time splitting the log cleanly. A triumphant grin spread across her face, and Ethan allowed himself a smile in return. Lunch was simple, stew warmed over the fire, but even in such humble surroundings, there was warmth in shared effort. Clara spoke softly about her journey, the letters she had written, the promises that had never been kept. Ethan listened, offering small encouragements, careful not to rush her. The openness between them grew in small, unhurried moments. By mid-afternoon, the wind had eased to a whisper. Ethan showed Clara how to check fences and repair broken rails. She watched him, admiration flickering in her eyes. He was strong, capable, and yet patient, qualities she had not expected from a man who had suffered loss of his own. Slowly, her guard began to lower. They worked side by side, clearing snow, hauling logs, and reinforcing the homestead. Each shared task brought them closer, a rhythm forming between them, punctuated by laughter, encouragement, and the occasional playful disagreement. Their partnership was practical at first, survival-driven, but beneath the surface, something tender and unspoken began to grow. As the day drew toward evening, Clara paused at the edge of the frozen pond. She looked out across the glimmering ice, taking in the stark beauty of the frontier. Ethan joined her quietly, standing a respectful distance away. "It's harsh, isn't it?" she said, voice thoughtful. "Yes," he admitted. "But it can be forgiving too, if you know how to read it, if you're willing to work with it, instead of against it." Clara turned to him, eyes catching the last rays of sunlight. "I think I understand that, a little." Ethan's chest tightened in a way that surprised him. He had spent years alone, convinced that love and warmth were behind him. Yet here, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, he felt a stirring he hadn't allowed himself in a long time, a connection, fragile but real, forming between two wounded hearts. They returned to the ranch as dusk fell, carrying the last bundles of firewood. Clara's movements were steadier, her confidence growing with each task. And as Ethan watched her, he realized that survival wasn't just about enduring the storm, it was about learning to trust again, to open oneself to the unexpected, and to find strength in the company of another. That night, as the fire crackled in the barn and snow drifted silently against the windows, Ethan and Clara shared a quiet meal. Their eyes met over steaming bowls of stew, and for the first time, there was no pretense, no fear, only a sense that together, they could face whatever came next. The blizzard had tested them, nearly claimed Clara's life, and forced Ethan to confront his own grief. But it had also revealed something else, the beginnings of mutual respect, camaraderie, and perhaps, the tenderest spark of love. The storm had finally passed, leaving the valley bathed in pale sunlight that glinted off the thick snow. Ethan and Clara had spent the morning completing chores, checking fences, and ensuring the livestock were fed and warm. For a few fleeting hours, it seemed as though the frontier had given them a reprieve, a chance to breathe and simply exist. But peace was fragile. News traveled slowly in the valley, but gossip traveled faster. By midday, a neighbor arrived at the McAllister ranch, their expression tight with judgment. "Ethan, there's talk in town," the man said, voice lowered. They're saying about the girl you rescued." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had anticipated scrutiny, but hearing it voiced made it real. "Let them talk," he replied, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed the irritation he felt. Clara, standing behind him, flinched at the mention of gossip. Her eyes flicked downward, and Ethan knew she had already endured enough shame. Before he could respond further, the sound of a horse's hooves approached from the main road, heavy and urgent. Clara froze. The vindictive husband, the man who had abandoned her in the blizzard, rode up to the ranch, a storm of anger in his eyes. His voice cut through the cold air. "Clara! Step away from this man. You belong to me." Clara's face paled, but Ethan stepped forward, blocking her. "She belongs to no one," he said, voice firm. "And you're not taking her anywhere." The confrontation brought a surge of adrenaline, the first real external threat they had faced together. Clara, though shaken, felt a new strength rising within her. She had survived the blizzard, she had survived neglect and betrayal. She would not be cowed now. "I'm done being afraid," Clara said, voice shaking but resolute. "I'm staying here. With him." Her hand brushed against Ethan's, a silent acknowledgement of trust and connection. The husband sneered, unable to comprehend her defiance. "You'll regret this, both of you," he spat, then turned his horse and rode off, leaving a trail of snow and anger behind. Ethan exhaled slowly, tension easing just slightly. He glanced at Clara, noting the trembling of her hands and the flush of emotion in her cheeks. She was scared, yes, but she had stood up for herself. And in that moment, Ethan realized something vital: this was no longer just about survival. It was about building courage, together, in the face of a world that often sought to dictate their choices. They retreated inside the warmth of the barn, where the fire crackled and smoke curled lazily into the rafters. Silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally, Ethan spoke. "You were brave out there," he said softly. "More than you know." Clara's lips quivered, and for a moment, her eyes met his fully, without fear or hesitation. I didn't think I could be. But I had to try." He offered a small, reassuring smile. "You're stronger than you realize. And I'm glad you're here. Not just because I saved you, but because I want you here." The words lingered, charged with meaning neither had spoken aloud before. Clara's hand brushed against his again, firmer this time, a gesture of trust and tentative intimacy. The air between them shifted, subtle but undeniable. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the remnants of the storm, but inside, a new warmth began to take hold. The threat had reminded them both of the fragility of life and the importance of choosing one another, even when the world pressed against them. By evening, the barn was quiet except for the crackle of the fire. Clara moved closer to Ethan, and he offered her a blanket. Words were few, but the unspoken understanding grew stronger. They were allies now, not just in survival, but in life. The blizzard had brought them together, and now, the world's judgment could not tear them apart. That night, as snow continued to drift softly outside, both understood that the hardest challenge was not the storm, but opening their hearts to one another. And for the first time, the possibility of love glimmered amidst the cold, a fragile but promising light in the vast, unforgiving frontier. The first frost had melted slightly, revealing patches of frozen earth beneath the blanket of snow. Life on the McAllister ranch carried on, but nothing was quite the same. Ethan and Clara had settled into a rhythm, tending to animals, mending fences, and sharing quiet meals by the fire, but the world outside still whispered disapproval. Word of Clara's stay with Ethan had spread through the valley like wildfire. Some neighbors eyed the ranch with suspicion, their whispers heavy with judgment. "Scandalous," one remarked to another at the general store. "A widower taking in a stranger, people will talk." Clara, who had endured betrayal and abandonment, felt the sting of gossip as acutely as any cold wind. Yet, each time she faltered, Ethan was there, not with lectures or arguments, but with steady presence. He never pushed her, never scolded, and his quiet support gave her the courage to face both the land and the world. One morning, Ethan found Clara struggling with a particularly stubborn fence post. She had tried to drive it into the frozen earth, but the ground refused to yield. He approached silently, placing a hand on hers to guide the hammer. "Lean into it, like this," he said, demonstrating the motion with a practiced swing. She glanced up at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You make it look so easy," she said, her voice lighter than it had been in weeks. Ethan chuckled softly. "Years of practice. But you're learning fast." The contact lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Clara's fingers brushed his, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. There was trust here, fragile but growing. A warmth bloomed in Ethan's chest as well, a sensation he hadn't felt since his wife's passing. He realized that the bond between them was more than convenience or gratitude, it was slowly evolving into something deeper. As days turned into weeks, they shared more than chores. They exchanged stories by the fire, laughing softly over shared memories of simpler times. Clara spoke of her childhood, of letters written in hope, of dreams delayed but not entirely lost. Ethan recounted tales of ranch life, of winters harsher than the one they had just survived, and of the quiet moments that had shaped him into the man he had become. One late afternoon, Ethan led Clara to a small grove of evergreens on the edge of the property. Snow sparkled like diamonds on the branches, and the silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of their boots. "This spot has always been mine," he said, gesturing to the clearing. "It's where I think, where I make plans, where I feel peace." Clara looked around, breathing in the crisp air. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Then she turned to him, eyes bright. "Thank you, for letting me see this. For letting me be here." Ethan felt his chest tighten. He wanted to tell her that she had changed more than just his days, she had changed his heart. That he no longer saw life as a series of empty routines but as something to be shared, someone to be shared with. Their fingers brushed again, this time deliberately. Clara didn't pull away, and Ethan's hand found hers, holding it gently. It was a tender gesture, but to them, it carried the weight of unspoken words, a promise that they were no longer alone. Evening descended, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The warmth of the day lingered, and with it, the beginnings of love. Both understood that there would be challenges, the scrutiny of neighbors, lingering shadows of past betrayals, but for the first time, they faced the future not with fear, but with hope. That night, as the fire crackled in the barn and the snow fell softly outside, Ethan and Clara shared a quiet moment of connection. A glance, a brush of hands, a shared smile. The trust they had built through survival, courage, and gentle care was blossoming into something tender, something enduring. The McAllister Ranch had become more than a place of refuge. It had become a place of healing, a sanctuary where two hearts, scarred by loss and betrayal, were beginning to discover that love, patient, kind, and redemptive, was possible once more. The peaceful rhythm of the McAllister Ranch was shattered one late morning with the thunder of hooves across the snow-crusted valley. Ethan looked up from the barn, where he had been mending a fence, and saw a familiar figure approaching, Clara's vindictive husband. This time, the man's eyes burned with fury, and his intention was clear. He had returned not to reason, but to claim and to threaten. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had anticipated this, but anticipation did little to dull the rising anger and protectiveness coursing through him. Clara, standing behind him, went pale, yet her gaze was no longer one of fear, it carried determination. She would not be taken back into a life of betrayal and shame. The husband dismounted roughly, snow crunching beneath his boots. "Clara. You come with me. You belong to me," he barked, the words sharp and demanding. "Not anymore," Clara said, her voice steady, surprising even herself. She stepped forward, shoulders squared, eyes locked on the man who had abandoned her in the blizzard. "I belong to no one but myself." Ethan moved beside her, a silent but firm shield. "And if anyone tries to force her, they'll answer to me," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of authority and resolve. The man laughed, a cruel, bitter sound. "You? A grieving widower playing hero? You'll regret this." He lunged forward, attempting to grab Clara. In an instant, Ethan was between them, his hands unyielding. A struggle ensued, snow kicked up around them, the cold wind biting at exposed skin, but Ethan's resolve was unshakable. Clara, fueled by the courage she had nurtured since the storm, did not retreat. She shoved against the man, breaking free from his grasp, and stepped closer to Ethan. "I'm not afraid," she said. Her voice rang with clarity, carrying the authority of someone who had reclaimed her life. The husband faltered, thrown off by her defiance and Ethan's unwavering stance. He glanced around, realizing the neighbors, some of whom had gathered at a safe distance, were watching. Murmurs spread, disbelief and curiosity mingled with the sight of Ethan protecting Clara with quiet strength. Ethan pressed forward, eyes locked on the man. "Leave now. Go back to where you came from, and never threaten her again. If you try, you'll face the consequences." His voice was calm, yet absolute, leaving no room for argument. For a tense moment, the husband hesitated, eyes darting between Ethan, Clara, and the onlookers. Then, seeing the unwavering determination in both Ethan and Clara, he muttered a bitter curse and mounted his horse. Without another word, he rode off, leaving the snow swirling in his wake. Clara exhaled, relief flooding through her. She turned to Ethan, her hand finding his. "Thank you," she whispered, a tremor of emotion in her voice. "For everything." Ethan's expression softened. "You don't need thanks," he said. "You stood your ground. You've shown courage. That's all that matters." The snow around them glistened in the afternoon light, a quiet witness to the storm they had just endured, not the one outside, but the one of fear, betrayal, and confrontation. In facing it together, they had proven more than survival, they had proven their commitment to one another. Ethan reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from Clara's face. Her eyes met his, warm and unwavering. No words were needed, every glance, every touch, every heartbeat spoke of trust, respect, and love that had grown amidst hardship. For the first time since the blizzard, they were truly free. Free from fear, free from judgment, free to embrace what had quietly blossomed between them, a bond forged in adversity, strengthened by courage, and sealed by mutual devotion. Clara leaned slightly into him, and he held her close. The world outside the ranch could gossip, judge, and threaten, but within the sanctuary they had built together, there was safety, warmth, and the undeniable promise of love. The confrontation was over. The threat resolved. And as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the snow, Ethan and Clara stood together, stronger, united, and ready to face whatever the future might hold, side by side. The days that followed brought a quiet peace to the McAllister ranch. The threat of Clara's vindictive husband had passed, and the townsfolk, having witnessed Ethan's courage and Clara's steadfastness, slowly began to soften their judgment. Whispers of gossip turned into murmurs of respect, as neighbors saw a man standing unwaveringly for the woman he cared for and a woman who had reclaimed her life. Clara and Ethan settled into a new rhythm, one built not only on survival but on connection and trust. Mornings were spent tending the animals, repairing fences, and clearing snow drifts left behind by the harsh winter. Afternoons brought shared laughter over small victories, successfully milking a stubborn cow, rescuing a horse from the icy pond, or discovering the first signs of spring beneath the melting snow. Evenings were for quiet reflection. They would sit by the fire in the barn, sharing stories of past joys and sorrows, gradually revealing layers of themselves that had long been hidden. Clara spoke of her hopes, the letters she had written in solitude, and the dreams she still harbored. Ethan spoke of his late wife, of the grief that had once consumed him, and of the newfound warmth that Clara had brought into his life. Each story, each word, wove them closer together. One particularly cold morning, as the sun cast pale light across the ranch, Clara placed her hand over Ethan's as he handed her a basket of eggs. She looked into his eyes, a gentle smile forming on her lips. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she said softly. "Not just from the storm, or from him, but from life." Ethan's heart tightened. "You've been brave every step of the way," he replied. "And now, you're not just surviving. You're living." He brushed a lock of snow-dusted hair from her face, and for the first time, there was no fear in their closeness, only mutual trust and love. The town's acceptance grew slowly, but the couple paid it little mind. They had found something far more important than approval, a home, a bond, and the chance to build a life together. Clara became fully integrated into ranch life, learning the routines, caring for the animals, and discovering joy in the small, steady rhythms of frontier existence. Ethan, in turn, found that his heart, long closed, was opening to love again, not replacing the past, but allowing him to embrace a future he hadn't dared imagine. As weeks passed, subtle signs of new beginnings appeared. Clara's laughter rang more freely through the barn, and Ethan's smiles, once rare and fleeting, became a constant presence. Their connection deepened, no longer tentative but strong and enduring, like the fences they had repaired together, standing resilient against winter's fury. One late afternoon, as the sun began its descent behind the distant hills, Ethan and Clara stood side by side atop the ranch's highest hill. Snow sparkled around them, and the horizon glowed with the soft warmth of a setting sun. They surveyed the land, their land, knowing that they had weathered storms both literal and emotional. Clara leaned into Ethan, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. "It feels like home," she whispered. Ethan wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "It is home," he said, his voice filled with quiet certainty. "Because we found each other." For a moment, they stood in silence, the wind whispering across the valley and the last light of day painting the snow in gold and pink hues. The isolation that had once defined Ethan's life had transformed into connection. The fear and abandonment that had haunted Clara were replaced by safety, trust, and love. Together, they had healed, not just individually, but as a pair, bound by courage, respect, and devotion. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch, Ethan and Clara smiled at one another, their hands entwined. The harsh frontier had tested them, shaped them, and ultimately led them to this moment. Here, under the fading light and the vast sky, they embraced a second chance, a life of love, hope, and new beginnings. The ranch was no longer a place of solitude, it was a sanctuary of redemption, healing, and the promise of all the days to come. And in that golden glow, Ethan and Clara's hearts beat together as one, the winter's trials behind them, and the warmth of love lighting the path ahead. If you loved Ethan and Clara's story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss another Wild West adventure.